This is the Energizing India podcast.
Vijay, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
Can I just get you to introduce yourself?
Vijay VAITHEESWARAN. I'm the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor for the Economist magazine of London.
Fantastic. I read The Economist on a daily basis. It's my go-to source of truth in this world where truth is fast disappearing. So it's indeed a privilege to have you in the Energizing India studios. Vijay, you're traveling through India because you're trying to get your head around hydrogen, green hydrogen, India's policy regulation, where we're moving. And of course, we want to talk about that subject. But since you've come from the US, I wanted to dive straight into the pink elephant in the room. And that is to talk about electric vehicle policy and electric vehicle industry growth in the United States. When you look at the world today, the snapshot of today, China is 80% of the EV market. Europe is the 15%, and the rest of the world is 5%, of which America is probably 3 to 4%. So America is just waking up, almost 10 years behind China, which for us in India is dichotomous. America is the land of the free, home of the brave, the center of innovation, where everything used to come from. What happened here? How did China steal the race in America?
America is the land of the free and home of the brave, but we're also the land of the open road and of cheap gasoline, cheap petrol. That is the American birthright. Whenever gasoline prices go above $1 or $2 a gallon, which is very, very low by international standards, 1/4 European levels, Americans basically make a big fuss. Any politician in charge is blamed for all kinds of sins, which is what happened to President Joe Biden lately. And so that plus the power of the incumbent fossil fuel industry, as well as the great car makers of Detroit, who fought tooth and nail against the new technologies of electric. And I think all of those combinations came together to be anti-innovation in a sense. Whereas what you had in China was an industry, the local auto industry, that tried for a couple of decades to copy, to emulate, to steal, to make world-class cars. It was a high priority for the Chinese leadership, and they just never cracked the code. No one anywhere outside of China said, I must have a Chinese car. No one still says that. And so that's because the internal combustion engine-based vehicle is incredibly complicated. Thousands of parts, 100 years plus of engineering and perfection that the Germans and the American car makers have had. That's why their products are so good. In contrast, when the opportunity came for electronics-based cars, which is what EVs are, electric vehicles, as you know, vastly simpler, just a few dozen parts, hardly any moving parts, and they're based on motors, power electronics, software. Guess what? Those are things that Shenzhen does well. That is, these are strengths that the Chinese have. Frankly, they're the world's best. And they've figured out how to do scale in electronics, scale in batteries. And so they suddenly saw an opportunity to leap ahead. And so bottom up from the innovation side in places like Shenzhen, which is the electronics capital of the world, where many iPhones are designed and made ultimately, and they're knockoffs, but also from Beijing and the power centers wanting to support and subsidize this through mandates, through various means of support. You suddenly had a fertile ecosystem for scaling up. And that's how they stole the lead. The good news for the rest of the world, including India, is it's not a defensible lead, precisely because there are not that many moving parts. It's not that complicated. Other people can do it too. It's not like trying to make a high-end BMW, which is quite hard to copy.
Fantastic answer. And in fact, when you look at the last 4 years, the surprising thing is you could be in a Chinese electric bus in Sweden, or the police in New South Wales in Australia are using, Chinese electric cars for some of the enforcement work that they're doing, which is, I don't want to use the word alarming, but breathtaking in many ways, the fact that it's moved so quickly. I like what you say, which is that in the end, it's a democratic technology and it'll move very quickly. Perhaps the issue, as you rightly pointed out, the roadblock was the fact that the entrenched cultures in the ICE mafia, whether it was General Motors, Ford, or all these big companies, was that they were petrol heads or diesel heads, couldn't get their heads around electric, and it was Elon Musk that kind of broke that, charged ahead for 10 years, and now a lot of them are catching up. And today, a number of the cars that have been launched are in fact much better than the Tesla. How do you see this EV evolution happening in the US? And I ask you that question because what happens there will eventually happen here. And there's a lot of money being pumped in by President Biden recently into electrification, decarbonized mobility. Where do you see that headed?
Just one sort of maybe a challenge, a different perspective. The U.S. does not have to be the template for the rest of the world, in particular because of legacy. Exactly the point I made that because Americans are so fond of and addicted to gasoline-powered cars, but also the infrastructure that's laid out. It's quite hard to overcome that legacy. The number of EV stations that have to be laid out is quite high. America is a very big and dispersed country. When you get outside both coasts, in Wyoming, you're probably not going to have a lot of adoption of EVs very soon because you're going to run out of juice very quickly in such a big state, or other parts of the Midwest and West. The other reason is that I think we're likely to see the lack of legacy because of penetration of automobiles. I mean, it's not just one car per family. There's often 2, 3, and 4 cars per family in America because of that legacy of car ownership and the necessity of it and the wealth of the country. In countries like India and others in the emerging markets where you don't have that degree of penetration, you may see other modes of transport, including public transport or shared mobility, which are more amenable to new means of transport, like electric, maybe even autonomous. So you might see that leapfrogging made possible by the absence of dirty old legacy.
Very interesting answer. I love your clarity. Vijay, before we get onto hydrogen, I want to tease an answer out to you. You spent a long time in China as the Economist editor resident in China. So you have a very good insight into China, America, the differences. And I want to tease a little bit of geopolitics out of you. We are today in a major supply chain crunch. There's blockages in China. There's a China plus one policy for many of the multinationals. How do you see the supply chain of decarbonized mobility moving ahead as a result of all the turmoil that we've had from Corona, the lockdowns, geopolitics between Taiwan, China, America, and this glaring need across the world to deleverage in some ways from China, having seen what's happened with Russia and Ukraine? I'm very keen on your assessment of what.
Well, you were absolutely right that the pandemic and related supply disruptions, not only because of the pandemic, but policies that were implemented around that time, broke the 30-year model, some call it the golden age of globalization, where really everyone pursued a kind of cheap China model. And we all remember that. Much of the world benefited from that. Certainly multinational companies benefited from the cost and quality that was made possible by sourcing. Consumers benefited from lower prices for goods, broadly speaking, that might have been possible otherwise. But it led to a monoculture, right? An excessive reliance on one thing. In nature, we know that's a bad idea, right? You find that that kind of reliance can lead to perverse consequences. And in this case, we're seeing it because of the COVID-induced lockdowns in China, but we're going to see it also possibly for political reasons. If there were to be some battle over Taiwan, we can see in the next 10 years that might happen. We might see it with semiconductors being affected much more dramatically. So what we're seeing is the rise of resource nationalism and other kinds of economic nationalism in the US, certainly in Europe, and of course in India as well, which always had roots and traditions of wanting to be self-reliant and independent. You're seeing those forces bolstered very much. Broadly speaking, this is an important and sober awakening. I think it's a good thing because for far too long, business managers, business schools like Harvard Business School used to teach that what you want to do is follow that cheap supply model, reduce costs a few percentage every year, but without thinking about what about resilience? What about some form of insurance policy? So for too long, we assumed things were not going to be risky. And it's not just China. We also have climate change risks now coming in as well. So there's multiple reasons to think about a riskier world and paying the proper price for having a resilient and redundant supply chain. So that's really the big meta theme in global business today in boardrooms. And that, I think, will feed into countries that, in a thoughtful way, pursue empowering local ecosystems, whether it's through policy or encouragement of new industries like hydrogen here in India, which I'm here to investigate and come to understand better. I think that's broadly a good thing. We're in this new reality for the next decade or more. My worry is that it will also empower those forces of protectionism and of economic nationalism that are not so high-minded or that are not so open to challenge. And so what you end up subsidizing the wrong things. You end up making subpar products. And if you're ultimately, we do live in a global economy. So if you end up with an ecosystem that's not able to compete against those from other countries because you just use rather crummy locally made products when you could have a very perfectly a good and cheaper substitute or better quality substitute from a friendly country, then I think that you're not doing your own country any special service. This is not just in India, there may be a risk of this. If you look in the United States, there is a powerful movement by the Biden administration, including in the new climate legislation that's just passed, that wants only nationally made, also union-made products. in order to qualify for subsidies from the government on clean energy or EVs. Now, those two goals might be very noble, empowering labor and having things made in America. But if it might also be much more expensive than products that are made in neighboring and friendly Mexico, which is no geopolitical threat to America. It might mean that electric cars are much more expensive in America as a result, or charging stations are more expensive because domestic products are favored. It might unfairly disadvantage India, which is going to have a fabulous export sector in a lot of these products. And why should that be the case when India is no security threat to America? The country should be mutually trading. The history of global economics is one of interdependence. And I do worry that this pendulum could swing too far.
So let's talk about climate change then. And I want to focus on hydrogen. Two questions, one related to America and the other India, that you're researching at the moment. America, again, late to the race almost. Europe stole part of the early hydrogen revolution. America's come on board. Major changes in the last few months in terms of government policy to enable the hydrogen industry. Let's talk about what's changed and how that will bring America back to the table on leadership for hydrogen.
Just in the last few weeks, we've seen a dramatic change. The turning point is from a position of having no meaningful federal policies or support for climate action, clean energy, other than sort of little bits and pieces of subsidies here and there from the Department of Energy. We now have the biggest climate change bill ever passed in the US Congress, $369 billion worth of money going towards all manner of clean energy, but also hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, and with 10 years of policy certainty, that because the tax provisions are not short-term, they're long-term now. So you get an effect in which we're basically going to see the floodgates open in America in terms of not just the public investment I just mentioned, but maybe 5 or 10x from private sector investment, whether it's ESG funding, which is counted in the trillions of dollars these days, which has been sitting on the sidelines, or even the traditional oil and gas industry. Historically, they'd been the enemies of action on this topic because they saw this as a threat to their business, because that's how the very progressive wing of American politics posed it. We must act on climate, down with big oil, and you're all part of the problem. Then the way this bill has been done, now it's a law, is to say, including hydrogen that might be made from fossil fuel sources, as long as you can capture the carbon, sequester it, so-called blue hydrogen in that case, or other technologies that might be consistent with a climate-friendly future, will allow the oil and gas companies to play a role in that if they change their behavior. And to me, that's a much more pragmatic approach. Now, what you suddenly have is broad support, bipartisan, including the industries that had previously been the toughest lobbies against it, and including the auto industry now sees its own future in electric cars, and now this bill is very supportive of that. I think what you're going to find is America, having been a laggard, is going to suddenly start racing ahead and doing the thing which it has always done best. That is, not leading on policy or lecturing or moralizing like the Europeans do, but on actually coming up with innovations and scaling them. And those will benefit and spill over to the whole world.
So to put things in perspective, $370 billion, if I remember correctly, when George Bush was exiting office and Obama was coming in, we had the global financial crisis, and it was $800 billion that was put aside to assist during the GFC. And you're talking about half of that really going into a climate initiative. That's phenomenal.
It's a lot of money, but again, I think it's just a fraction of what is now going to be unleashed because of the signaling effect. It is now no longer acceptable in American politics and business to be anti-climate, and in fact, every incentive in your direction. You can tell your shareholders and your investors that this is clearly the way America is going. We need to get in on this, and so we're going to see a gold rush.
So let's talk about India then. You're here to research the Indian Hydrogen Initiative. You've been all across the country meeting lots of people in government, academia, industry. What have you found in terms of any similarities? Where do you think India is headed in this race to be a hydrogen global leader?
So I don't have the final answer yet, but here are some of the questions that I'm hoping to publish in The Economist, hopefully in a few weeks with these answers, so our listeners can turn to The Economist. What is India's potential to really leapfrog ahead on renewable energy and green hydrogen? That's the question I wanted to look at. And, it's happened before with software, famously so in the South. We saw the leapfrog on software. A little bit less successfully, but with the auto sector and auto components. And so my question is, what is it about this sector that could lead to a world-class industry here. Is it more akin to software, or is it maybe a little bit more like the auto sector, where India has had success with some components and certainly better than it used to be, but nobody in the world says, I must have my Indian-made car. Other than in India, that's not yet a thing. And so the question is, will people say, India producing hydrogen, competitive, beautiful quality. I want to have that electrolyzer made in Pune. That's the one that's we're really going to clamor for. Can India compete on the world stage? And so I think it has many endowments, engineering skills, ecosystem of smart, talented people, including global NRIs and foreigners who are willing to come and be part of the ecosystem. India is a richer country than it was 20 years ago, so it can afford to pay for some of the necessary technologies in the ecosystem, and has phenomenal renewable resources. We know some of the best and cheapest solar energy resources in the world, as well as potential for storage and so on. So I think that the foundations are there, and the government policy seems to be quite supportive. In the early stage, this is what has to be the case because it's a nascent industry. Some of the traditional barriers, the license Raj, the difficulties of getting small industry going, also what might be the role of the big boys. Some of the big billionaire tycoons have gotten into this. Will they behave nicely? Will they try to monopolize or oligopolize this industry? These things remain to be seen. So I see both the opportunity, but also some of the challenges that have to be overcome.
It looks like it'll be an article almost every 12 months for the next few years as the industry evolves.
It's a growth industry for energy journalists.
Excellent. Vijay, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you in our studio. Fantastic answers. Can't wait to read the article and have you back in our studios in your next visit.
It's been a great pleasure.